Hello there, and welcome to A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. Well, 1 out of 3 isn't bad, I suppose. I'm afraid this one, as I said 2 weeks ago with Fear Street Part 1, this might not be for me. Despite my love of horror, my travails into horror, the writing I have done on horror, not all horror is made equal, and not all horror is made for everyone. Because, as I said, again, repeating myself from part 1, R.L. Stine obviously wrote for an introductory, or wrote horror in a way that allowed new entrants to horror to enjoy the material. Now that was obviously primarily with his Goosebumps work, but the vibe I'm getting from Fear Street, having never actually read any of his Fear Street novels, based on this, is that this is not quite a full step beyond that. That again, it's very Goosebumps structure. It has a very similar structure of pacing, style, characters, the kind of horror, the kind of monsters, feel very Goosebumps, but now with gore and sex and swearing, and it's like, okay, but it's the nuances aren't there, and the sense of development isn't really there for you don't get a sense of a different kind of horror with it. It is very simple, or rather very basic. Because as I said, part 2 I really liked, because part 2 really felt like a throwback to 70s, 80s slashers. Obviously, with the summer camp setting, the period setting really suited its style. Now, I was hoping beyond hope, that this was going to be a escalation, where part 1 wasn't great, but part 1 was sort of throwing back to 90s slashers. Part 2 is a lot better because of throwing back to 70s, 80s, and then part 3 would sort of embrace the classic, partly the sort of Hammer horror style, which obviously, which though obviously being made in the 60s and 70s, tended to make a lot of period set horror, or more contemporary stuff. And there is one obvious contemporary inspiration for this that I'll come to, but I was hoping it would take a lot more cues from that. Unfortunately, okay, there are two aspects of this, because the film, the third film in this trilogy, whereas the other two have been an anthology with a tenuous link, part 2 has characters from part 1 at the beginning and end to sort of bookend, to bookend it, or as a framework. Part 3 goes a slightly different direction, where it's half of this 1666 period setting, and then half a return to the 94 setting, where the characters from that story get to complete their arc. And I suppose in that respect, I need to approach it from two different perspectives. As I said, the 1666, I was really hoping for something that was sort of inspired by The Witch, because that, in terms of a historical set horror, honestly changed my perspective on how you could tell horror. It really was, and having only been a few years old, I genuinely think it creates a sense of atmosphere and setting, and the line between madness and the supernatural that felt refreshing and original. Unfortunately, there is a sense that 1666 is trying to capture some of that. However, it comes across a little bit more like when Vampire Diaries would flash back to period settings, where the actors are trying their best. They are trying to do what they think is sort of accents of that time period. The language feels very flowery, And then there is a sense of authenticity. And to their credit, the set design, it looks good. It looks, you know, it does have a good setting to it. But there's just something a little bit off. There's something a little bit too contemporary about the style of it. Where with The Witch, it genuinely felt like something that was appropriate for the time. I don't know, there was something about the way that they performed with each other, the atmosphere, the cinematography that just gave it just a sense of, you know, historical precedent. Whereas this does feel too much like, you know, a young, sexy historical. And again, like I say, they are trying their best. The actors and even the makeup and stuff is trying to look. It's not trying to look modern and sexy. It is trying to look a bit dirtier and a little bit more period accurate. But there's just something underneath it, underneath the facade of it, that just feels a bit too, I don't know, it feels too modern, too stylized in modern filmmaking. And of course, broadly speaking, so this solves the mystery of the first two parts and sort of begins to resolve the witch story, the Seraphia storyline, and you know what started all of this. And as I've said in my other horror videos, horror comes from ambiguity and uncertainty, from interpretation, from a lack of knowledge. The idea of that, you know, we are more horrified by what we don't know or understand than by what we do. And of course that means horror endings are incredibly difficult to do. Stephen King famously struggles with endings because he can create this sense of atmosphere and tension and world building, and yet he has to resolve his stories. And unfortunately, it's difficult. It's difficult to, you know, many horrors possibly should just have an end point, an unexpected end point where you go, I don't fully know what happened, you know, and it's, you have to sort of piece it together from the context of what you've watched, rather than, of course, something like The Conjuring, which is my prime example of horror where it starts with a really... What is it, The Conjuring I'm thinking of? Insidious, sorry. Where the Insidious starts with a really phenomenal premise and atmosphere and a sense of personal stake, where it might be supernatural horror or it might just be the projection of trauma. And then there comes a point somewhere in the second act towards the third act where they bring in comedy Ghostbuster characters and a witch character whose job it is, or psychic character whose job it is to explain what is going on and contextualize everything. And unfortunate, and I hate that, because I think that underserves what horror is supposed to do. You know, going back to Colour Out of Space from a few days ago, you know, though yes, you do get a sense of what is going on, the ending is more atmospheric than it is expository. And so therefore you're getting to the end of it and you're like, I think I understand, but I'm not sure. And there's so much going on and things are shifting so quickly that you don't have your footing, so you're more immersed in the feeling than you are needing to understand. This really does do the opposite. The whole point of the Seraphia, or the 1666 part of the film, is to essentially explain what happened. And there is a really good tragic element to it that actually parallels the main character from part one, Dina, with the character of Seraphia, you know, both being, as it transpires, queer characters, but obviously one being in the 90s and one being in the 17th century, so you can imagine the sort of the difference that has. And there's a sense of and like I say, it does capture a bit of The Witch, and there is that sense of paranoia to it, where things are going wrong for this village, and it might be supernatural, but it might be just because poverty and famine and just difficult lives. And so, of course, they immediately, you know, attack the people that they think are responsible. You know, there is an old versus young element to it. There is an outsidering and an othering of, like I say, queer characters. That you get that sense of escalation as people become more mob-like in hysteria. And when it was about the hysteria, that's when I was interested, like I was in part one. When it's about things that might have an explanation or might be random, have a hysterical effect on local people, that was the thing that really I was drawn to. But instead, it decides to solve everything. It turns the character Sarah Fear from this interesting atmospheric villain from the first two, the sort of architect, to a false victim. A tragic lover who was actually a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator. And it's just, and the way it sort of explains everything is fine. It is an explanation of what is going on and why everything happens the way it does. But again, it undermines any sense of fear in the Fear Street. And so then you come back to the present day, the present day of 1994, and essentially it's just a repeat of Act 3 of Part 1. Where it's them facing off against the same monsters that they faced off from the first one. But now there's actually like a motivation of they have an idea of what they have to do and how it all gets, how they can end the curse and who is actually behind all of this and why. And again, at this point, yes, okay, it's fine. It's just standard face-off ending. But at this point, the horror of it is just gone. It's just gone. It is just now it's just a teens versus monsters type, almost action fantasy or action horror. But the definition of the horror aspect is it's gone. And then it resolves everything in a fairly tight and tidy way. And frankly, it's just an underwhelming ending at that point. It's just, okay, yep, this is just going to wrap everything up in a really clear, good versus evil way that sort of takes all the nuance, takes all the uncertainty, ambiguity, out of it. It is just, as I said earlier, Vampire Diaries style, where it is just, there's a little bit of an idea there, but they're just going to scrap it in the end for more traditional fantasy good versus evil kind of storytelling. And there is an idea in that second half as well about the oppressed and sort of the sort of social injustice where the characters who are still around are essentially represent minorities and oppressed and groups and traumatized and abused people who represent minorities and groups who are the ones who historically have had that experience, and they kind of, between the four of them, represent that sort of five, technically I suppose, that sort of spread of trauma and and abuse and oppression. And the person who's behind it and the villain is a straight white man, and you can sort of see the meta text there and the idea of why this person is doing it and who they're doing it on behalf of. And there is sort of a commentary there, but again, the commentary is a bit cack-handed. It's unnuanced, it's very simple, very basic. And so, yeah, it's all just a bit... Even Gillian Jacobs being prominent in that second half is not enough to make it... to save it, really. No, it's as I expected. I was gifted by having part 2 be a little bit more than what I thought it would be. But as a whole, it isn't for me. It isn't something I would use to introduce someone to horror. If they were a child, yes, but again, as I say, this isn't for children. This is, sweary, violent, people shagging all over the place kind of thing, and it's not appropriate for a younger audience, but I don't think it's as clever and nuanced enough for even a teenage audience. I feel like there are much more interesting horrors that I think would be better to show someone who wants to have a better introduction to the genre. As a whole, it's disappointing. There is also a teaser for future, one of those sorts of it's small enough that if this doesn't get picked up for a second series of films, it doesn't matter. But there's a tiny sort of suggestion of further, a further idea. I don't think I would watch it. I don't think I would. I don't feel like I would. And if it came back whilst I was still doing this, which is increasingly unlikely, but I wouldn't come back to this even to discuss it on here, because it's just not. I think I didn't do this series to essentially badmouth things that I don't enjoy very much, especially when I can tell effort's been put in. It's just creatively, it's not something that resonates with me and doesn't appeal to my sensibilities of a genre. Yeah, disappointing. A bit of a flat ending, really, but these things can't all be winners. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video, because those all help me in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that little bell to get notifications of when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of almost 200. We are days now from it. And follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I'm always tweeting about films and TV shows, and I share these videos once they've been uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thanks again. Take care.